Well, hello there, and thank you very much for clicking on this video today. So today, we are looking at something very specific and interesting. So you may have known, or might know, that Amnesty International released a report which was basically an examination of the effect of gender-critical movements and gender-critical people and the growing anti-trans sentiment in the UK, and what impact that is happening, and who is to blame for this, and who are the major actors in doing this. And this caused quite a lot of press coverage initially, and then had people like J.K. Rowling basically flipping her lid, along with other people and organisations that were mentioned in the particular report from Amnesty International. And then she then said, well, I've got millions and millions of pounds to waste from my terrible books. I will give money to anyone that wants to sue them, basically. And because of our laws in the UK around things like libel, which are not great, it is very easy to sue someone in the UK. They kind of backed down and basically removed the report or buried it. Unfortunately, I've been the not great amateur detective that I am, actually found it. I used a few links and downloaded the report, and we're going to go through it. Now, I'm not the only person that has talked about this particular report. People like Dr. Helen Weberly and a few other people have talked about it, but what I haven't really seen is I haven't seen anyone really go through all of it, all of the details. I've only seen little bits of the media analysis. So I don't put much stock in what the gender critical people have to say about this report, because in reality, the mega rich can silence people with threatening people through lawsuits. Even kind of non-profit NGOs like Amnesty International can basically be threatened with that. So let's delve into it, shall we? Right, so I'm just drinking a bit of tea. And so, let's go into it. Let's actually go into the document and see what it actually has to say. So, like a snowball, the growth and impact of the gender critical movement in the UK. Executive summary. So, at a time when human rights protections are being weakened across the board, a movement against the rights of women and LGBT people is growing in the UK. In recent years, governments have passed laws that greatly limit the right to protest and introduce draconian immigration and asylum rules. And since 2010, cuts to social security and reduced funding of public services has worsened poverty and made living conditions harder. Amnesty International UK has spoken out against repeated attempts to scrap the Human Rights Act and against calls from some politicians to withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights. So, in July 2025, Amnesty International released a study of 65 anti-rights groups in the UK, 32 of which spent $106 million from 2019 to 2023. And from looking from the people that flipped their lid over this, it's the labelling of anti-rights groups that in particular pissed people off. But anyway, let's continue. So, a rise of more than a third. The study showed that the biggest spenders are the UK branches of US groups like Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF UK, whose spending grew by 258% between 2019 and 2024. The ADF played a pivotal role in overturning Roe versus Wade in the US and keeps challenging the rights of women and LGBT people worldwide. The investigative reports have shown how ADF influence in the UK is growing and its close ties to the Trump administration. This briefing examines the nature and role of the gender-critical GC actors. Even though their starting point on issues of gender is different from those of such actors, such as the ADF, and other ultra-conservative Christian groups, their objectives in relation to trans people are remarkably similar, which, on a personal level, I would agree with. The growth and influence of the gender-critical movement have been worrying, made normal and supported by the media. Our research shows that media has produced a disproportionate amount of coverage about trans people from 2020 to 2025, and the words gender and critical have become common in such stories. More importantly, the voices of trans people have almost been completely absent. The mapping identified 51 gender-critical actors, most of which are informal. However, two of the most well-known groups, The LGB Alliance and Sex Matters are registered UK charities, whilst others are registered companies. So we go into the methodology of this. So this briefing consists of two parts. The first part presents the findings of corpus linguistics analysis into how the British press typically presents issues related to trans people and whose voices are given prominence. Corpus linguistics analysis considers the reports of four major outlets, so this is what they're looking at: The Guardian, The Sun, The Telegraph, and The Times and Sunday Times, and this is between January 2020 and April 2025. The methodology is explained in full in the Technical Explainer. So the Technical Explainer was basically a other document, which is quite a lot shorter, which we won't be going through because it basically just details the methodology, which I don't think is terribly important to what we're talking about. And if you really want to know about it, you can look it up online as part of that. So the second part is a mapping of gender-critical actors based on the analysis of websites, social media accounts, press mentions, and records held by the Charity Commission and Companies House. The mapping includes an analysis of available financial records of GC actors for the financial years of 2019 and 2024, focusing on spending as a key metric. For each year, for example, 2023, Amnesty International UK considered the fiscal year that began in 2023, whether it ended in 2023 or not. So let's go over basically their key findings. What caused such outrage amongst a lot of quite awful people. So, between January 2020 and April 2025, media coverage about trans people has been exclusively high compared to the size of the trans population, the role of society, and public interest in these topics. Across the four outlets, a total of 17,000 articles were published between January 2020 and April 2025, an average of 264 articles per month, or 9 per day, which is huge when you consider the actual size of the trans population, which is not that big at all. Most media reports about trans people have a negative sentiment, while trans people are hardly seen in the stories. When do they appear? It is as criminals or murder victims. For each year analysed, the UK Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, and the Scottish First Minister appear consistently, suggesting that issues of sex and gender have been elevated to the top of political priorities. Since 2017, a diverse and coordinated gender-critical movement has appeared in the UK. Of the 51 organisations Amnesty International UK mapped, only 3 were established before 2017. Except for 3 registered charities, Sex Matters, Philia, and LGB Alliance, well over half the groups mapped are informal, 32 in fact, followed by registered companies, 17 of which is now dissolved. 17, one of which is now dissolved. Analysis of the available accounts for Philia, Sex Matters, and the LGB Alliance for the financial years of 2019 and 2024 show a combined expenditure of 3.6 million. So now I'm going to go into the origins of the gender critical movement in the UK. There's a reason why the UK has become known as TERF Island amongst quite a few people. So, the 2017 to 2018 Gender Recognition Act consultation. So, transphobia, like other kinds of prejudice, is a widespread problem in society that existed before the current gender critical movement, but the origins of the gender critical movement in the UK can be traced back to 2017 and 2018, when both the Scottish and Westminster governments held a public consultations on amending the Gender Recognition Act of 2004. The GRA is the law that sets out how a trans person can have their acquired gender legally recognised by the government. Under the GRA, the first step to get a gender recognition certificate is to obtain a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. The GRA was groundbreaking in 2004, but it does not meet the current human rights standards. It treats trans identity as a medical problem, which does not match the real experiences of the trans community. In June of 2018, the World Health Organization took the decision to remove gender dysphoria from its list of mental health disorders and classify it as a sexual health issue. Recognizing that gender dysphoria is not a mental illness and calling it one had caused stigma against trans people. And it's not too far away from when, being gay was considered a mental health disorder, Both Scottish and English consultations suggested changing the law from a medical process to an administrative one, removing the need for a diagnosis and allowing a trans person to legally change their gender through a statutory declaration. Two consultations ran in parallel in the span of a year. The Scottish Government's consultation ran from November 2017 to March 2018, and the English one from July to October 2018. Over 15,000 people replied to the Scottish consultation and over 100,000 to the English one. Just before the English consultation closed, a gender-critical group called Fair Play for Women bought a full-page ad in the free newspaper, The Metro, to encourage people to oppose the proposed reform and provided a pre-filled form to respond to the consultation. Over 18,000 responses were sent using this form. Analysis of the submission to the Scottish consultation found that women's groups gave arguments remarkably similar to those of Christian groups, focusing on how the reform would threaten women's spaces, marriages, family, and the safety of women and children. Women's groups often worried that the GRA, based on an administrative system, so-called self-ID, would let violent men claim to be women to enter women's spaces. At this point in time, women's groups used the terminology of sex-based rights in their arguments rather than gender-critical. As a result of the backlash and change of government, the GRA reform was shelved, even though 61% of respondents in the English consultation agreed with the removal of the requirement for diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So in the English one, anyway, it doesn't really seem to say much about the Scottish one. The majority of people that responded were actually in favour of it. And it was just removed because of lobbying, essentially. So the dehumanisation of trans people and fear-mongering. Starting with the backlash to the GRA reform, gender-critical narratives have been presenting trans people, especially trans women, as deceitful and dangerous. According to the gender-critical view, making the GRA an administrative system would allow cis men to identify as women to attack cis women in singular spaces such as toilets. These claims are deeply at odds with the reality of male violence against women in the UK. In 2024 to 2025, 80% of perpetrators of sexual violence was someone the victim knew, mostly a partner or ex-partner, amounting to 43%, followed by family members, friends or dates, 38%. Only 15% of women reported being assaulted by a stranger. Many trans women are also the victim of sexual assault. Although the sample sizes are small, in the year ending 2025, it is estimated that 19% of trans women reported sexual assault or attempted sexual assault. There is no evidence that in countries where legal gender recognition is based on the administrative system, this has caused an increase in violence against cis women perpetrated by trans people. Equally, there is no evidence that since the GRA became law in 2004, there's been a systematic issue of trans people attacking cis women. And the statistics back that up. The statistics that they cite here, which they provide at the end of this, they provide several pages of where all of their figures come from. So it's completely referenced. But this idea that trans women in particular are deviants that are just trying to change using this to basically hide their desires to sexually assault people so they can get into women's spaces is ridiculous. There's no evidence to back that up at all. There just isn't. Like, I have never really seen a case. And what is more important is gender-critical people can never cite any cases at all. I've seen them try. So, let's move on. So, 2019 to 2025. From gender-critical as a protected belief to the Supreme Court judgment for women Scotland versus Scottish ministers. So, the term gender-critical entered the public discourse around 2024 in connection with the Employment Tribunal case, Forrester versus CGD Europe, which ruled that the gender-critical beliefs are capable of protection under the Equality Act of 2010. In the Employment Appeal Tribunal, gender-critical belief is described as the belief that biological sex is real, important, immutable, and not to be conflated with gender identity. She, the claimant, considers that statements such as a woman means an adult human female or trans women are male are statements of neutral fact and not expressions of antipathy towards trans people or transphobic. This means that a person with gender-critical beliefs considers trans women to be men and trans men to be women, regardless of what they have on their JRC. The judgment was clear that while the belief is capable of protection, there may be circumstances where it is not protected. And it quotes, "This judgment does not mean that those with gender-critical beliefs can misgender trans people with impunity. The claimant, like everyone else, will continue to be subject to the prohibitions on discrimination and harassment that apply to everyone else. So it's not a freebie. It's not a get out of jail card to basically just harass trans people, just because it could be considered protected, as this statement in the case makes clear. The recognition that gender-critical beliefs can be protected under the EA was a pivotal moment in the growing trajectory of the movement. In fact, while the press initially accurately reported the nuances of the Forrester judgment, over time the nuances have become lost. In our assessment, this has contributed to the normalisation of all manifestations of gender-critical belief, including misgendering and talking about trans people with reference to their biological sex, and trans women as biological males. However, misgendering could amount to harassment based on gender reassignment under the EA, as pointed out by the Forrester judgment itself. When the gender-critical movement began to mobilise, preventing the reform of the GRA was the main goal. Once the GRA reform was shelved, gender-critical actors started focusing on the use of the term gender in policy and lawmaking, which, in their view, had created a lack of clarity, putting cis women's safety at risk and hindering accurate data collection and policy making. The key demand of gender-critical actors in this respect was to clarify the meaning of sex in the EA. This eventually resulted in April 2025 in the infamous Supreme Court judgment on a case that started in 2018 by the gender-critical group Women of Scotland to challenge the Scottish Government's interpretation of the EA in relation to achieving gender parity in the composition of governing boards of public bodies, which included trans women in the GRC. The UK Supreme Court ruled that trans women or trans men with a GRC is not to be considered as a woman/man for the purposes of sex discrimination under the EA. While the case was only about the EA, it severely reduced the scope of legal gender recognition across the board. So let's move on. The judgment relied on the existence of the characteristic of gender reassignment to protect trans people from discrimination, and that interpreting sex as a certified sex, i.e. based on the marker of the GRC, would cut across the definition of the protected characteristics of sex in an incoherent way. The judgment has not changed the law, but its interpretation. Soon after the judgment, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the HRC, the body tasked with enforcing the EA, published a non-statutory interim update, which recommended excluding trans people from single-sex spaces and services. The guidance also said that trans people could potentially be excluded from spaces aligned with their sex assigned at birth, too. In the EHRC's view, a trans man should be excluded from men's spaces, but could also be excluded from women's spaces, which align with his sex assigned at birth if his gender presentation could cause alarm or distress for others. So you can see in how this legal judgment, it's catch-22 in what they've said. So basically, a trans man could be excluded from men's spaces because they were not assigned, because that is not their assigned sex at birth. And they can't, but they also can't use women's spaces either. So it is effectively just erasing them from society, which is the goal, in my personal view, of the gender-critical movement, to basically erase trans people from society by pushing them to the sidelines and ensuring that they really can't go out in public without facing condemnation, without facing harassment. Anyway, let's continue. Afterwards, the EHRC opened a public consultation seeking views on its proposals on how services and associations should implement the ruling. The proposals advise that service providers should somehow ascertain a person's sex assigned at birth, but that doing so could constitute a violation of the right to privacy. The confusion resulting from this advice has led to reported increased harassment suffered not only by trans people, but by cis people whose gender presentation is non-conforming. At the time of writing, a final code of the practice has not been published, which at this point it has been, but we're not going to get into that now. So, the parallels between GC and the ultra-conservative Christian actors. So, the corpus linguistics analysis shows that the press portrays the gender-critical movement in a mostly positive light, working for the benefit of women and children against so-called gender ideology. Even though gender-critical actors perspective on what they call gender ideology is different from that of the ultra-conservative Christian groups. In our assessment, they share the same goal when it comes to removing legal protections for trans people. The ultra-conservative Christian actors, such as the ADF, seek a society where women and men have different and rigid roles based on what they describe as natural or traditional. In their view, the concept of gender, which means that a woman's and men's roles are socially constructed and therefore can change, is a threat and that it must be rejected. So gender-critical actors instead consider gender identity the intimate sense someone has of their gender that may be different from the sex assigned at birth, as reinforcing damaging stereotypes. In their view, so-called gender ideology pushes gender non-conforming young people, in particular masculine lesbians, to think that they are men and should transition. While their starting points are different, we consider the demands of the gender-critical actors to be the same as those of the ultra-conservative Christian groups, abolishing legal gender recognition, the exclusion of trans people from spaces aligned with their gender, and restricting access to inclusive relationships and sex education. For example, in April 2026, gender-critical organisation Women's Sports Union joined forces with the ADF International, threatening to legally challenge trans-exclusive sports bodies in the UK if they fail to protect women's sports from transgender ideology. So you can actually see, as much as these gender-critical people flip their lid and throw a hissy fit when you make accusations that they actually do align with far-right Christian groups, they've actually literally joined forces. Like, this is not conjecture, this is fact, I'm afraid to say. So, the removal of legal gender recognition. Legal gender recognition is a question of self-determination, essential for trans people to be able to fully enjoy the right to privacy, to marry, and to family life, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment, and to guarantee the best interests of their children. The European Court of Human Rights has recognised the need for legal gender recognition to protect the rights of trans people in the Goodwin case, which the GRA derives, as well as other cases. As a result of legal challenges by gender-critical groups, in the UK, legal gender recognition has been restricted, if not made redundant. So, we go on to attacks of bodily autonomy. So, bodily autonomy is the right to exercise control over sexuality and reproduction, and to be able to chart the course of our lives. This includes the right to access healthcare, including contraception, abortion, for trans people, gender-affirming healthcare, without fear of discrimination. In the UK, compared to the US or some European countries, legal challenges to limit access to abortion has historically been unsuccessful. In our assessment, legal challenges to the ability to consent to gender-confirming healthcare pursued by gender-critical actors are not only shared by ultra-conservative Christian groups, but also work as a proxy to diminish access to healthcare across the board, including abortion, contraception, by undermining the Gillick competence. So let's go into what the Gillick competence is. I like this stuff. I like learning about law and stuff like this. So Gillick competence is a legal principle originating from a case dating back in 1984, Gillick versus West Norfolk and Wisbech Area Health Authority. In this case, a Catholic mother, Victoria Gillick, challenged her local authority and Department of Health and Social Security on issued guidance in relation to how doctors should deal with children under 16 seeking advice on contraception. According to the guidance, whether to prescribe contraception to adolescents was at a doctor's discretion, and it could be prescribed without parental consent. Gillick argued that if doctors followed this guidance, they would be acting unlawfully. In the first instance, the case was lost, but she won at appeal. The case was eventually heard by the House of Lords, which supported the first decision. So, according to Christian Concern, oh, Christ, these fuckers. Oh, so a fun fact about me, I'm just going to take a little sip of tea. Oh, that's nice. I'm drinking Earl Grey. So, I'm a religious person. Shocker, I know. I'm in fact a Quaker, and if you are a religious person and you kind of move in semi-religious circles, you often run into other people in religious groups, especially other Christian groups. And I've run into Christian Concern people, and I would describe, I don't know the people that run the organisation personally, I don't know them, but I have met supporters of them, and I would describe them as some of the most awful people I've ever met. I wouldn't, if they were on fire, I would not piss on them to stop if they were on fire, I would not piss on them to put them out. That is how I feel about them. And Christian Concern are an ultra, no, I was going to say ultra orthodox, I doesn't even cover it, really. They're a hard right evangelical Christian organisation that lobbies the government constantly on pretty much everything you can imagine. They have links to people like Nadine Dorris and other kind of conservative folks. They're basically the reason why the ban on conversion therapy never really happened under the Conservative government. It was proposed under Theresa May, I believe. It was a long time ago now, and is only about to happen basically around about now. I don't know exactly when it's going to be done, but it's going to get done at some point. And they are basically the reason why, even though it's proposed over a decade ago, it never happened, because they lobbied like hell to stop it. So that's who they are. So, Christian Concern, which has a history of challenging access to abortion as well as gender-confirming care, Gillick Competence has a long and unfortunate history as regards to undermining parental rights and Christian moral reasoning in medicine. At the time of writing, gender-critical campaigners are challenging the establishment of a medical trial for puberty blockers, supported by Citizen Go, an organisation established in Spain but active globally whose strapline is defending life, family and freedom across the world. An organisation that I am also a far-right Christian-leaning organisation, which I am also not as familiar with, but I am aware of them. So, the role of media in the growth of gender-critical movements, the ongoing disproportionate levels of reporting. So, between January 2020 and April 2025, 4 outlets combined published 16,913 articles, an average of 264 articles per month, or 9 articles per day. The Times and Sunday Times have the most coverage, with an average of 83.5 articles per month. The Sun has the least, with an average of 38 articles per month. Coverage increased particularly in 2022 and 2023. However, a rapid increase in coverage started before 2020. Previous corpus linguistics analysis has shown a sharp growth in the amount of press coverage related to so-called trans issues, with roughly 3.5 times as many articles in 2018 to 2019 compared to 2012. In addition to the increased volume, the sentiment of coverage was negative, with trans people being increasingly described as involved in controversy, demanding or aggressive with a propensity to be offended, which, as someone that does know a few trans people, is a really gross mischaracterization and outright defamation of their character. Like, they just want to live their lives and be respected and not be discriminated against. That's it. And the fact that you have so many articles covering what is a really small group of people, which we'll get into, tells you something about it. So the corpus linguistics analysis Amnesty International UK carried out shows that the coverage remains high and entirely disproportionate to the size of the trans population, which is, according to the 2021 census, represents 0.5% of the population, so 262,000 people. Coverage is also disproportionate to the public interest and to the degree of influence trans people have in society. For example, ahead of the 2024 general election, issues related to the trans rights, or sex and gender, did not figure in the top 16 concerns for voters. However, based on the study of press reports ahead of the election, the issues of sex, gender and sexuality were by far the most reported amongst the so-called culture war issues in the 4 weeks ahead of the election. And at this point, they provide a little graph here, which you should be able to see. Frequencies of reports in January 2020 to April 2025. So compared to other outlets, coverage in The Guardian was more international in outlook and covered other issues related to trans people, for example, reporting on the condition of trans people in several countries, or in specific circumstances such as immigration detention, immigration detention, sorry, I lost my place. On the contrary, the reporting in the Times and Sunday Times, Sun and Telegraph was almost exclusively focused on the UK. While coverage volumes remain constant, it was also possible to identify spikes in coverage corresponding to specific events, as shown in detail in the technical explainer. The increased volume of reporting typically focuses on relatively negative events for trans people around reporting on someone else's gender-critical views. For example, in April 2022, 3 notable events took place. The government announced it will put forward a ban on conversion practices that excludes trans people. British Cycling banned trans women from competing at elite level in its events. And the EHRC published guidance on separate and single-sex services. During this month, across the outlets, reports increased by at least 40% compared to the monthly average of that year. Another notable spike in reports coincided with the publication of the final reports of the CAS review in April 2024. During this month, reports increased by an average of 80%, 78% compared to the monthly average in 2024. So you can kind of see how there is this issue of basically manufacturing opinion, where basically these outlets just routinely churn out what is mostly, certainly coming from this analysis, negative coverage of trans folk and trans issues to basically manufacture negative opinions in the public over trans people because they keep churning it out. So we go on to whose voices are being represented. The analysis of bigrams, i.e. 2 words occurring with each other, in this case proper nouns, presents 2 stark findings. Trans people barely figure in the coverage, while most of the names of the individuals are high-profile politicians. Across the entire coverage, only 2 British trans people appear: Brianna Gray, I think that's spelled there, and Isla Bryson. Brianna Gray was a 16-year-old trans girl murdered in a public park by 2 teenagers. I think we all remember that. On 11th February 2023. While her murder was initially reported as not to be a hate crime, it was later appeared that transphobia was a motivation. I have seen some of what those killers said to each other, referred to her as an it. They referred to her as being a monster and being not human. It was undeniably transphobia. Her killers were sentenced to 20 years and 22 years, respectively, on the 2nd of February 2024. Across the outlets, Brianna Gray appears 16 times. And Isla Bryson is a trans woman who, before transitioning, was convicted of a sexual violence offence in 2023. Bryson was initially placed in women's prison, segregated from other inmates following the public outcry. Bryson was then transferred to a male's prisons. Isla Bryson appears a total of 8 times. And whilst trans people are virtually invisible from the coverage of these issues that affect them, successive prime ministers and the longest-serving Scottish First Minister regularly occur as bigrams, suggesting that trans issues have been elevated to the top of political concerns for the press. The most recurring name in bigrams is by far J.K. Rowling, and they provide a little chart here, which you should be able to see, so you can get a sense of it. So, qualitative analysis of press reports on sex and gender. What occurs with gender and how has it changed? This section looks at a consistent collocates for the search term gender, i.e. words which are within the top 10 most statistically likely to occur with gender across multiple months. It focuses on 3 consistent collocates which appear across all 4 outlets: recognition, identity, and critical. Gender and identity. In the reporting, gender identity is most of the time used to refer to one's internal sense of self, and rarely used in different ways. So it gives some examples. So, in The Guardian, gender and gender identity do not collocate in the reporting in March, July, and December 2022. Collocates that appear within these months are focused on the GRA. In The Sun, except for 2023 reporting, The Sun publishes significantly fewer articles than the other 3 outlets. In 2020, gender and identity were only statistically significant collocates in 2 months. This increased to 5 months in 2021, 8 months to 2022, and 2023. In 2024, the collocation appeared in 5 months and in 3 of the 4 months analysed in 2025, except for February. So, a Telegraph, like all of the other outlets, reports on gender in Telegraph regularly collocated with identity. After 2020, the only times when identity was not statistically collocate of gender were in July and September 2021, December 2022, and November 2024. as in previous outlets. When identity does not appear with gender, other collocates typically focus on JRCs. So the Times and Sunday Times, the only month in which gender identity did not collocate in the Times was March 2020. During this month, the focus was more on the GRA. And again, it provides graphs and charts and things you can actually look at which demonstrate the data. So here we go. And let's go down. So, gender and recognition. The findings suggest that all the outlets analysed have had a continual focus on the GRA from July 2020 through April 2025. Except for The Sun, the outlets have been consistent in often discussing the GRA in reports about trans people. Typically, when recognition collocates with gender and other collocates, such as certificate or act, also collocate with gender, suggesting a discussion about the GRA or the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill, examining a random sample of 100 accordance lines for this collocation. All instances referred to as GRCs, 54 instances, or the bill itself, 46 instances. Of the 54 instances that discussed GRCs, 50 were used in ways that explain them as a technical term, i.e. what gender recognition certificates are. The other 4 instances come from quotes by gender-critical activists expressing negative views about GRCs. So let's go into some of them. So gender and recognition in The Guardian collocated fewer times than other outlets. This suggests that there was less focus on the GRA in The Guardian's reports. Indeed, the collocates in the months that do not discuss gender recognition also appear to focus on various medical procedures, processes, and medical care. Sometimes collocates about children also appear within these. Where examining these in context, they appear to refer primarily to people seeking gender-affirming care and their views of those who seek to prevent this for children. So, as it often is, it's always the critics getting the biggest words. So, when it comes to The Sun, as previously discussed, in many of the months of the reports, gender did not have any statistically significant collocates with The Sun. This extends to recognition too. What such trends show, therefore, is that while gender and recognition did frequently collocate, discussion of the GRA or gender recognition more broadly was much less prevalent in The Sun's reporting. So The Telegraph, like The Times and The Guardian, recognition collocated with gender. In most of the months of reporting, like other outlets, most of this discussion focuses on GRCs and GRA, or the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill. Interestingly, in the months where recognition does not occur, except for July 2025, critical does occur with gender, possibly suggesting a shift in focus of narrative within the outlet. And with the Times and Sunday Times, as with identity, gender and recognition collocate across multiple months of reporting in the corpora. So it then provides, again, another little graph. I'm going to take another sip of tea. Okay. So, gender and critical. The findings on the collocation between gender and critical show a significant and marked increase in reporting on gender-critical views. Across all newspapers, such views were regularly reported neutrally. The number of articles which actively challenged even the use of the term gender-critical was much rarer compared to authors describing people's views as gender-critical. In addition, to the outlet-by-outlet analysis shown, Amnesty International also carried out an analysis of random sample of 100 concordance lines across outlets between 2021, when gender critical first started appearing, and 2024, to explore whether there were any indicators of articles distancing themselves from the phrase gender critical, including referring to these views as anti-trans. The random sample showed that only 21 instances of articles referring to gender-critical views as anti-trans, while they were qualified with only 21 instances of articles referring to gender-critical views as anti-trans, while they were qualified with so-called 35 times. In 3 of those 21 instances where anti-trans was used, instead of gender-critical, it was used to say that calling gender-critical views as anti-trans was wrong, or that gender-critical views were allegedly anti-trans, which gender-critical views are anti-trans. There's just no way of getting around it. Anyway, similarly, In 5 out of 35 instances, so-called was used to express that the term TERF, trans exclusion radical feminist, was a pejorative description, 3 times, or an insult, 1 time, to people with gender critical views. In the remaining instance, it was used in a paragraph where the article described people with so-called gender critical views as having won. So let's go into that. So the Institute of Contemporary Music Performance in North London was criticised for a sign telling staff and students that it had zero tolerance of TERF ideology, in which it called a specific form of transphobia. The term is used to is an insult to people who have so-called gender critical beliefs that biological gender cannot change, and this is coming from the Times, the 5th of November 2022. All this takes place in the context of reality that for the most part so-called gender critical feminists have prevailed. Self-ID is dead, killed in Scotland by the women who wouldn't wish it. I think that's a typo there. Nicola Sturgeon and Isla Bryson, the Scottish debacle has persuaded Keir Starmer's government to abandon its promises to legislate on this issue, according to the Times, on the 13th of November 2024. So let's move on to The Guardian. So compared to all the other outlets analysed, The Guardian has the earliest example of a month of reporting where critical collocated. January 2020, of 7 instances of this collocation. 6 are from the same article, sacked or silence. Academics say they are blocked from exploring trans issues. Universities are at a loss as to how to maintain free speech when both sides claim they feel unsafe. This article primarily addresses the gender-critical ideas in university settings. This collocation does not appear again until May 2021. Then more often between 2023 and 2025. There has thus been an increase in references to gender-critical perspectives, though some of the examples in concordance lines for this collocation questions the appropriateness of the phrase. So, going to The Sun, Critical starts collocating in The Sun in August 2021, then in July 2022, and in August 2023. In 2024, Critical collocates appeared in reports in March, April, May and September, and then again in April 2025. Overall, Critical is much less likely to occur in The Sun compared to other outlets. This is not to say that such ideas are absent from The Sun, rather that the label gender critical is somewhat absent from the month-to-month reporting of this outlet. So going to The Telegraph. The Telegraph began to collocate with gender in August 2020. In reports from The Telegraph, like other outlets, Gender and Critical do not collocate again till the following year. But in 2022, 2023 and 2024, they collocate in every single month of reporting, except for April in 2024. The collocation also appears in January, March and April 2025. There is a clear increase in the number of times this collocation is used each month, from infrequent to appearing almost every month. So, going into the Sunday Times and Times, the collocate Critical it first appears in the Times and Sunday Times in May 2021. The initial reports that uses collocations typically refers to academics, others discussing gender critical beliefs in relation to the policies of the LGBT charity Stonewall. Critical then appears as a collocate of gender semi-frequently in 2022 and 2023. There is a notable change in 2024. The only month without Critical as a collocate of gender was in December 2025. Only in the January data did not show Critical as a collocate of gender. This shows an increase in the number of months where Gender and Critical collocate, suggesting an increased number of reports featuring gender critical as a phrase and by extension normalizing the use of the phrase. One way that gender critical was used and what it occurred with was the term feminists, as in the trigram gender critical feminists, and it provides a chart here. So, what occurs with sex and how has this, changed? So, across all 4 outlets analysed, collocates varied month by month, and were used to refer to a range of related topics. One such was about sexual intercourse, shown through collocates such as consent, anal, and condomless. Another group of consistent collocates across all outlets referred to issues of relationships and sex education, e.g. education, relationships, and history. There are multiple collocates that discuss sex in the terms of sexual orientation, such as same attraction, sexuality, and gay. issues related to trans people in the context of sex education were framed as controversial or negatively. So, they give examples. So, Rishi Sunak ordered a review of sex education in March after there were claims of age-inappropriate material asking children whether they were planet non-binary, as well as teaching them about breast binders and a galaxy of genders, according to the Times, in 2023. As with gender, the collocates of sex vary from publication to publication, but unlike gender, they are more varied, with fewer consistent collocates. This is to be expected given the wide range of contexts which use the word sex. Several collocates that appear at different points in the reporting across the publications were associated with gender-critical narratives such as single, spaces, biological, and immutable. For example, this is highly contested. It's quite something for a leader of a political party to effectively imply that one of us is morally wrong, especially when the courts have established that the belief in the relevance of biological sex is a protected belief in the Equality Act. That's coming from Sonia Soda in The Guardian, 2021. And this is coming from The Telegraph. So Keir Starmer has been accused of peddling shameless work of fiction after government claimed it had always supported single-sex basis for biological women, coming from The Telegraph in 2025. Like other collocates for gender, many of these views are platformed through assigning such views to others, including nameless people. For example, Starmer has been accused of peddling, but from an unknown or unnamed person or group. So, now we go into mapping the gender critical movement in the UK and kind of how it's sprung up. So, organised opposition to the rights of trans people emerged at a time of consultation to the GRA in 2017 and 2018. This reflected in the mapping, with only 3 of 51 organisations existing prior to 2017. My God, that's hard to say. So, the gender critical ecosystem is diverse, and while it is possible to identify groups with distinct priorities and tactics, all share broadly the same goals and appear to closely collaborate and endorse one another, contrary to these groups mapped previously, which are predominantly registered as companies or charities. Over half, 32, of the 51 actors mapped are informal. The largest group of organisations, 17, are employees networks in different sectors such as civil service, education, health services and retail. Many are branches of SEEN, Sex, Equality and Equity Network, which according to the website has the aim of supporting staff with gender critical views to promote sex equality between women and men in the workplace, from the perspective that sex must not be conflated with or replaced by the concepts of gender or gender identity. However, it is challenging to determine how many SEEN branches are active in workplaces, as some exist only as an account on X. The largest group, 16, consists of organisations concentrating on restricting gendered spaces to cis women and excluding trans women through policy, advocacy and campaigning activities. Finally, 6 groups are so-called LGB organisations. 3 groups which are active on the front of children and family issues, 3 in education, 4 within political parties, the Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, Greens, etc., and 2 provide services, and they provide a pie chart here to give you a kind of better figure of how many there are and how it plays out. So, and this is kind of the thing, is these organisations always can claim that they are actually grassroots organisations, that are not related to big spenders, which is not true. But anyway. So, financial resources of the gender critical movement. In contrast to organisations analysed in the first part of the research, all gender critical groups mapped, except 3, are informal or micro companies, and therefore it is challenging to understand the financial resources they have available. So, in my personal speculation, a lot of these organisations quite deliberately structure themselves in a way which keeps how much they're getting funding or who's funding them kind of shadowy. Kind of like Reform. 2 out of the 3 charities, Philia and the LGBT Alliance, have available accounts for the financial years of 2019 to 2024 and 2020 to 2024, respectively. Sex Matters registered as a charity in April 2024 and produced its first accounts in April 2026. 3 charities went from Philia, spending £80,000 in 2019 to a combined spending of £3.6 million between 2020 and 2024. Most of the fundraising done by gender-critical groups over the past few years has been for legal challenges. Analysis of case pages on the Crowd Justice website, a crowdfunding platform for legal challenges, shows that as of the 4th of March 2025, 45 pages raised just over £3.2 million, 6 pages raised over £100,000, 3 pages raised over £200,000, and 1 page raised over £500,000. So you can kind of see how these organisations are basically using what you might call lawfare, to restrict the rights of trans people in the UK. So, changing attitudes towards trans people. As shown in the briefing, the coverage of issues related to trans people continues to be disproportionately high and mostly negatively framed. While the volume and legitimisation of the gender critical positions have grown. In the same time frame, reported hate crimes have also increased. I bet there's no coincidence there. Since 2017, hate crimes against people with protected characteristics of gender reassignment have continued to grow and increased by 56% in 2020 to 21 and 2021 to 2022, and again by a further 11% the following year. The number recorded incidents decreased by 2% between 2022 and 23 and 23 to 24. However, to put these figures into context, hate crimes are often vastly underreported. In 2017, the government's LGBT survey found that at least 2 in 5 respondents had experienced verbal harassment or physical violence in the past 12 months preceding the survey, but more than 9 in 10 of the most serious instances went underreported, often because respondents thought it happens all the time, which unfortunately, when it comes to discrimination against people, whether they're gay people, trans people, or anyone else who's kind of in that protected groups, is very common. Sometimes there's often just the reluctance of the police or law just won't really do anything, which is very often unfortunately true. And there's also the fact that this is so kind of prevalent in society and so common that if you did it every time this happened, you'd be phoning the police like constantly. Be phoning them every day. And public attitudes have also worsened. In 2023, I always keep saying 2000, sorry. In 2023, the British Social Attitudes Survey found that over the previous 40 years, that public attitudes on a range of issues have become more liberal. For example, the percentage of people that believe that sex relations amongst adults are not wrong at all. Who believe that same-sex relations amongst adults are not wrong at all, grew from 17% in 1983 to 67% in 2023. However, attitudes towards trans people have become more negative. Between 2019 and 2023, there was a 23% decrease in the number of people who thought that trans people should be allowed to change their sex marker on their birth certificate, from 53% to 30%. General prejudice against trans people has also grown, with the proportion of people who characterise themselves as not prejudiced at all against trans people falling from 82% to 64% since 2019, which is of course the goal of the gender critical movement and the media outlets that give them a platform. That's the purpose of it. You keep talking about a particular group of people negatively, constantly, over and over and over again, and eventually people will start to absorb that negativity, that hatred. It's been not just against trans people, but it's been demonstrated numerous times throughout many societies against many different groups of people. You keep putting out your propaganda or whatever it is you want to call it, and saying that group of people are evil, or they're transgressive, or they're doing wicked things. You keep doing it again and again and again, and eventually it starts to seep into people. So, a YouGov study reaching back to 2018 confirms this trend, noting growing skepticism on trans rights among groups that used to be, on average, more liberal on these issues, such as women and young people. For example, in 2022, the proportion of women supporting legal gender recognition has been 44%, with 32% opposed. The figures now are 37% to 42%. The timeline chimes with the rise of the gender-critical actors responding to the GRA reform. So let's get to the conclusions of this, because we've been going for quite a while. And if you're at this point, I very much appreciate you. This has been a long one. I'm sure listening to me reading all of this is... I try my best, but I'm not perfect at this. So, since 2017, an organised gender critical movement has emerged in the UK. Firstly, to push, and I suspect this conclusion is what, amongst other things, has really flipped people out. So, an organised gender critical movement has emerged in the UK. Firstly, to push back against proposals to reform the GRA. Once the GRA reform was achieved, the GC belief was recognised as capable of protection under the EA. The movement pursued two main objectives. Firstly, the attempt to remove legal gender recognition through changes to the EA, and secondly, restricting access to gender-affirming healthcare, in particular challenging the capacity of the under 16 to consent to medical treatment. Corpus linguistics analysis shows sustained disproportionate levels of press coverage of trans issues between 2020 and 2025, averaging 264 articles per month across the 4 outlets considered. The bigrams analysis shows that trans people are virtually invisible in the content that concerns their lives. Top politicians instead recur regularly, which suggests that trans issues has been elevated to key political priorities. So, the contextual analysis of the word gender shows a marked increase in reporting on gender-critical views across all newspapers. Such views were regularly reported uncritically. The number of articles which actively challenged even the use of the term gender-critical was much rarer compared to authors simply ascribing these terms to people's views. The impact of the coverage of trans people's lives is very tangible. Of over 4,000 people surveyed by Transactual between 2024 and January 2025, therefore, before the Supreme Court judgment, 99% said that transphobia in the media affected their mental health. And 87% reported that having heard transphobic statements from politicians in the 12 months prior to the survey. More than 90% of respondents believe that transphobia in the media had also impacted their treatment by strangers, family members, friends, and colleagues in negative ways. Almost 60% of people surveyed said they felt less hopeful about the future since 2023. Which is just sad, really. Anyway, the UK government has an obligation to uphold the rights of trans people, including the right to health, privacy and non-discrimination. What this analysis shows is that trans people's well-being and public attitudes towards trans people have worsened since 2017. In conjunction with the rise of the gender critical movement, the press has a critical role to play in shaping public attitudes and holding the government to account for its actions, or lack thereof. To support journalists in their daily work, the following practical recommendations are designed to help incorporate more accurate, fair, responsible reporting on issues affecting trans people. Amnesty International recommends the following. So, let's go through these. Seek advice from trans-like organisations with communication and media expertise to improve editorial guidelines. Reduce coverage to evidence-based reporting on issues that do affect trans people directly. When doing so, ensure that voices of those affected are front and centre. Do not dehumanise trans people, e.g. by asking gotcha questions such as, can a woman have a penis? Cover positive stories about trans people, their lives and contributions to their society and communities. Do not frame reporting as a debate. Provide nuance with discussing legal issues. When mentioning the gender-critical belief is protected under EA, clarify that the expression of such belief is not protected if the manner of expression constitutes harassment or discrimination. For example, misgendering trans people or creating a hostile environment through repeated or offensive conduct can cross the line into unlawful behaviour under the EA. As it should do for anything. Trans people are not a freebie just to harass and discriminate against. If you did it against another person for a different reason on the basis of religion or race, we wouldn't be entertaining the argument that somehow a legitimate view, would we? Increase the representation of trans people in reporting, both as authors and as respondents. Ensure trans people can represent themselves on their own terms and do not ask them to justify their own existence and human rights. Qualify gender critical and explain that it's an ideological stance that seeks to restrict the rights of trans people held by some lobby groups. Do not imply that gender critical views represent all women's views, because they don't. Do not contribute the expertise of gender critical campaigners when they're not qualified to speak on a specific issue, such as gender-affirming care. And we have here an entire several pages. I'm just going to flick through them just so you can see. Several pages of news reports, huge amounts of references. So this is very well sourced. So if you're at this end, congratulations, you've read to the report that Amnesty International put out that the gender critical campaigners and J.K. Rowling, who is at the moment facing her own controversy recently because she upskirted a trans woman. She's very keen to look at people's genitals. You know, that's not creepy at all, not a warning sign. That the gender critical movement is there and works with the Christian far right, who we've talked about, and they've worked together in many instances to restrict and slowly whittle down the rights of trans people and to dehumanize them. Now, there is a lot of words, a lot of words and issues raised in this document, and I can't summarize them all, but I think that is the best summary that can be given about this, that it is very clear that that is what they want to do. This is not a debate, this is just a group of people that are just targeting a group of people that they dislike for whatever irrational or illogical reasons that they have. And they want to strip their rights away, they want to target them, they want to make their lives miserable, and they want to make sure that they are erased from society to the point where that trans people can't go out in public without being harassed. You know, J.K. Rowling think it's fine to upskirt trans people. She's literally done it and talked about it on Twitter, and people had a go at her for doing it. This is what they think, and this is what they want to do. And the reason why this particular report almost certainly caused the media coverage and controversy that it did is because it lays out in no uncertain terms the data behind it and who are the offenders. It's a shame that they pulled this down, because I'm not a researcher in this area, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know for certain. But I think that all that they've said here could be backed up in court quite easily. And to be honest, if this was a report that was published in another country, which didn't have the UK's screwy laws about libel, they probably could publish it and not have to take it down. So, thank you very much for listening in on this very long video today. I will catch you later, and I hope that you have a good day wherever you are. And it's going to take me quite a while to edit this and upload it. So, you have a good day. Bye-bye.